It's time now for the first keynote presentation on the program. The NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission has been working on implementing a nationally consistent approach to registration requirements and practice standards for psychosocial disability service providers. Now, Speaker Commissioner Graeme was appointed in December 2017 as the inaugural Commissioner, and he joins us today to provide the opening address. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Graeme.
Morning, everyone. I'd also like to thank Aunty Donna for her words and echo my respect for Aboriginal ownership of the land that we're on, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander colleagues who are here with us today. Thanks for asking me along this morning. It's a really important event, and congratulations to the organisers for achieving such a huge interest around the country. It's difficult to pull people together when we can't be face to face, and that's the way we're used to doing things. But I think we're getting better at using these new technologies to start and continue important conversations. I feel that it's necessary, given the number of people who are here, to just do a bit of a whirlwind tour through what we're doing in establishing a national regulator for quality and safeguarding in the NDIS, because not only is the NDIS really a very, very significant change to the way disability supports are funded and provided, but we've never had national quality and safeguarding regulation of this sort in the country before. And in fact, disability supports, when block funded in states and territories, were subject to a really variable array of safeguarding arrangements, some long-standing, some relatively comprehensive, some not very comprehensive at all, and really there's not been in any part of the country before the Commission was stood up the set of arrangements that we have under, in a sense, one roof. So a regulator that has a complaints function, as was mentioned before, a standard setting function, holding providers to account for complying with those standards, investigative powers, a dedicated function dealing with behaviour support, and a reportable incidents and incident management function. So it's a very significant shift, and part of what I'm going to run through is quickly where we are on the journey of getting the organisation set up, and then I want to talk about a couple of particular areas of focus for the organisation that I think will be of particular interest to the people who are attending this forum today. Don't stick slavishly to the slides. I won't be. You'll have them afterwards, but I often feel it's more helpful in these forums to get a read of the room and to make sure you've got something that gives you the factual outline, but where I can amplify a few things. So the first thing to know is that we were initiated with a phased approach. So we have not been operating nationally since 2018. As Daniel said when he was introducing me, we did. I was appointed in 2017, started in January 2018, but not in the Commission, because the Commission didn't exist for some months after that, but I was in an offline role assisting the Department of Social Services to stand up the new body. And we've had a three-phased commencement of our operations, and those phases have broadly aligned with the movement of a particular state or territory into the full scheme of the NDIS. So we've been working in New South Wales and South Australia since 2018, July 2018, everywhere else bar WA since July 19, and WA commenced later than originally intended in December 2020. There was a delay because of the desire of providers in Western Australia not to have to deal with COVID issues and a transition. So we are now operating nationally, and all of the functions that the Commission's responsible for are operating in each state. Each of those functions, though, is somewhat different generally than what was in place before when states and territories were operating. Important for people to know that in respect of the very important concept that's already been mentioned this morning by Sam of choice and control in the NDIS, that in terms of the Commission's regulatory functions, that has an important design implication. People with disability who are NDIS participants and are self-managing can choose to use unregistered providers for most types of supports. We regulate all providers, whether they're required to be registered or not. If you're a registered provider, there are a whole lot of conditions of registration that you have to apply, you have to comply with. And this morning it was mentioned about the practice standards, which are a very important anchor for everything we do with registered providers. But if you're an unregistered provider, you're subject to the Code of Conduct. It's not a voluntary code of conduct, it's an actual regulatory instrument. And if you're a person with disability who has chosen to receive supports from an unregistered provider because you're self-managing, you can still complain to us and we can still take regulatory action against an unregistered provider and deal with a complaint about that unregistered provider. So very important to know that this is a scheme where all NDIS providers are regulated, some through the registration process, which also requires compliance with the Code of Conduct, and some exclusively through the Code of Conduct. And what determines that is ultimately connected to the choice a self-managing person with disability makes about where they're accessing their supports. So we're an organisation that's here to regulate support providers, and many of our functions are connected to our powers to regulate providers and to work with participants on not just ensuring that system level issues are addressed, but in responding to particular issues of concern for people with disability about anything related to their supports and services. We don't regulate the NDIA. We're here to deal with how participants experience the supports they receive from their support and service providers. When I talk about us being a regulator, we have very strong regulatory powers, but it's an explicit part of what we do in the National Quality and Safeguarding Framework that we also work on building capability in the sector and supporting people with disability in developing capability, that we're not just focused on corrective action, we're focused on developmental and preventative work as well as responding to acute situations. So for participants, in broad terms, we're here to support a participant's right not just to feel safe, but to be safe, respond to complaints and concerns, promote safe and good quality supports, ensure that providers follow the rules and identify areas for improvement across the NDIS market, and also to work with the NDIA on identifying how and responding to how the market itself is evolving. You know, a statistic I often remind people of about, you know, quality and safeguarding is that when New South Wales, FACS, the Department of Family and Community Services, after the movement of hack services out of that domain, In the year before the NDIS Commission started, or the year before the NDIS started in New South Wales, there were about 750 providers that FACS dealt with who were providing block-funded disability supports. When we transitioned New South Wales providers into our jurisdiction in July 2018, that number was between 5,000 and 6,000. So it's not just the fact that there's a new national regulator. The range of organisations that are subject to this regulation is profoundly different to what existed before. Obviously, part of our job is, and our focus for the first couple of years has been this massive transitional task of moving a very large number, almost 20,000 providers, into this new system, getting those providers audited against practice standards, standing up our complaints function, our behaviour support function, our reportable incidents function, and also doing very important work with the states and territories on establishing a dedicated worker screening system for the NDIS, which commenced in February this year, everywhere but the Northern Territory, which will start before the end of July, and also working with the states and territories on a nationally consistent approach to the way the use of restrictive practices is regulated by states and territories, where that's a co-regulatory response. We do recognise that part of the Commission consolidating, now that it's largely through that transition work, means that we need to focus in very tightly on the unique needs and the differing needs of different groups of people within the NDIS itself. For people with psychosocial disability, we do acknowledge that many will have experienced particular challenges in accessing the NDIS and in receiving supports that cater for their individual needs and recovery-oriented approaches. And for many participants with psychosocial disabilities, the development of plans and service agreements is still a new experience, and people will have had a variable experience with those processes. In our experience to date in dealing with complaints that participants raise with psychosocial disabilities raise with us, it's often important to consider the extent to which the provider has really understood the person's individual needs and what's important for the person they are supporting in terms of their mental health and recovery. We're also very mindful that participants with psychosocial disabilities may, based on their experiences of the past, be very hesitant to raise complaints. In the first instance, they may have had negative experiences. As a consequence of raising complaints, there may be low levels of trust based on those experiences, or just a low level of awareness of what an organisation like the Commission can do and how it can support a person to resolve issues that matter to them. We also recognise the impacts of stigma and trauma and the importance of trauma-informed approaches in supporting people with psychosocial disabilities. What we're focused on at the moment that I think this forum will be interested in is a couple of key things. Many of our functions, we deliver outcomes through the way we regulate providers and what we require them to do. The complaints function is the main point of our array of functions where we're dealing directly with people with disability about things that are of concern to them, or we're dealing with people who are raising concerns on behalf of a loved one, or in the case of advocates on the part of a client. Bedding the complaints function down is a very high priority for the Commission at the moment. Where we receive negative feedback about processes, it's often about the complaints function. And there are a range of reasons for this. It is often the case that complaints bodies are separate bodies. They exist to consider complaints and then make recommendations to other parties about what can be done in response to a complaint. We have the benefit of having a complaints function nested inside a regulator with quite powerful regulatory tools. And the challenge for the Commission is making sure that that function is truly integrated to the rest of the work of the Commission, and also to make sure that our complaints staff understand that not only do all NDIS participants have the rights that are set out in the CRPD and where the quality and safeguarding framework is there to support the upholding of those rights. They also, if they're making a complaint, or any complainant has a unique set of rights as a complainant. So we're there to uphold human rights generally, but also in the complaints function to make sure that the rights that a person has as a complainant are respected in the way we apply our own rules. So we're doing a very significant amount of work at the moment to respond to issues that people have raised with us. I've always said that we would not wait for the transition to be completed to reflect on our own practice and reflect on the experience that people are having in dealing with us, that we can listen and adjust along the way. Robert Grew, who's the Complaints Commissioner and will be well known to quite a few people in this room since he began a year ago, has been doing a very significant piece of work on looking at how we adjust the complaints function so that it's easy for people to deal with, and that we recognise all of the factors that may influence how a person feels making a complaint, and that we can be more responsive, respond earlier with complaints resolution processes, and ensure that our staff are well equipped to respond to the needs of a wide array of individuals. So we do have mental health expertise and psychosocial disability expertise on our consultative committees, but in the complaints function we are setting up a dedicated external assurance process. So we have a new internal assurance process, new procedures for staff, new training for staff, but we will in fact have an external reference group that will include people with lived experience, including lived experience of psychosocial disability, and will be led by our Complaints Commissioner and by the head of our Southeastern branch, Dr. Lynn Colson-Barr, who's the former Victorian Mental Health Complaints Commissioner. So we're putting a lot of effort into the complaints process generally in responding to feedback, and we shared some of these improvements with a National Advocates Forum similar to this virtual forum yesterday, and I think there's a fair bit of enthusiasm for these changes. We're also looking at alternative intervention models and looking at what we need to do in terms of supporting our staff with trauma-informed care training for Commission staff. Because I only have a few minutes to go, the other area of work that I think will be very significantly of interest for people here is the work that we're doing in respect of positive behaviour support. So the Commission has a leadership role in respect of positive behaviour support, and what that role consists of is really the leadership role in respect of what the framework agreed to by governments in 2014 on the reduction and elimination of the use of restrictive practices, which is now part of the National Quality and Safeguarding Framework, we're really driving, I guess, the move towards the aspirations in those two framework documents. So we have a dedicated area of work in the Commission led by a senior practitioner. That is a role that's enshrined in the Quality and Safeguarding Framework, and our behaviour support function is driving to that goal of reduction and elimination of the use of restrictive practices. We have a lot of work on foot in respect of that. Some of that work is about working with states and territories on the fundamentals, getting the processes of oversight and authorisation working properly. And some of that work is about the developmental and preventative work, working with providers, working with people with disability on alternatives to the use of restrictive practices, but also honing in on areas of poor practice of providers, the widespread use of unauthorised restrictive practices, the widespread use of antipsychotic medications as chemical restraints, the widespread appearance of polypharmacy. So there are a range of issues that are already subject to a national compliance initiative, which is aimed at making a very significant shift away from really practice that was often hidden and very poor practice to practice that we are able to identify and target through both developmental work and also straight out compliance work. So there are a range of large providers around the country who are already subject to compliance action in this work. And I would really love at another opportunity to either by myself or with the senior practitioner actually have a deeper conversation with the people who are part of this forum today about the work of the Commission in Behaviour Support, because I think it's a critical area of our work, and I think an area of critical interest for people with lived experience of psychosocial disability and people who work in the field. I'm getting the wind-up signal, so I will leave it there. Oh, no, I've got 1 minute. I'm sure I don't really have 1 minute, but so I guess what I would ask people in a forum such as this to take away is that there are lots of new opportunities because for the first time we have a national regulator in this space with an array of strong regulatory functions, but also a capacity to do capability building and preventative work. That there are areas of our work which will benefit from the insights of people who are part of this forum today. That, as with all startups, we have been very focused on getting the foundation elements in place and working properly, but the entire Commission is now swinging. I think the current jargon is pivoting, but it's not a word I like. We're shifting basically from the focus on transition management to the focus on impact. How do all these new tools drive towards impact for the people for whom this safeguarding framework exists? So, those of you who monitor what organisations like mine are doing, when you look at our end-of-year activity report, you'll notice, for instance, that there's not just an increase in the number of complaints we're seeing, but there's a very significant increase in the amount of compliance, formal compliance activity undertaken by us. And I would venture to say that when this financial year is complete, there won't have been a financial year in this country where so much compliance action has been taken in respect of disability support providers. So really is still a very new thing, but a new thing that has tremendous potential and very, very broad powers and the capacity over time to become, I think, very responsive to unique needs across the entire community of people with disability who are NDIS participants. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak to you.